Hi everybody, welcome back to our last AP Euro review session before the exam on Friday. Obviously you can still ask me questions in class, but this will be my last stream before this exam. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I thought I would start while I'm waiting for people to get on here and waiting for questions to pop up to just go over some of the stuff that we've done more recently or that you've only read about, but we haven't really had a whole lot of time to talk about in class. One of the big terms that I think I didn't even remember to use in class was the phrase détente. It's spelled D-E with an apostrophe, T-E-N-T-E, and it's a French term that basically means like a cooling down of tensions during the Cold War. So from the early 1970s through the 1980s, there was kind of a cooling down or a détente that involved things like some nuclear test ban treaties and arms limitation talks between the two superpowers. I think the most important of those would be the SALT treaties, S-A-L-T, which stands for something like Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, probably. That was signed, the SALT II Treaty was signed in 1979 between Jimmy Carter, the American president, and Brezhnev, the Soviet premier, who followed Khrushchev. So the nice thing about the Soviet premiers is they don't rotate as often as American presidents do, so it's a little easier to keep track of their names. You basically have Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev. So those are that's one big term I wanted to cover. Another one that I wanted to talk about was just looking at my list here. So before détente, you had this idea of mutually assured destruction, that like if there was a nuclear war, that people were avoiding nuclear war because they saw it as a way they saw it as leading to mutually assured destruction. So they didn't want to start a war because that was probably going to also end in their destruction, which is why this Cuban Missile Crisis was so stressful. And you see such a rise of things like the installation of nuclear like basements and shelters and things that people were putting in place because of fear of nuclear attack. Um, so during détente, there's a little bit less of a focus on that and a lot more focus on, like I said, the test ban treaties limiting the test of nuclear weapons, arms limitation talks. I think that while their relations were kind of thawing during that period, the Soviet Union still was pretty hardcore about their ruling of Eastern Europe. Examples that we looked at in class were the Hungarian uprising and the Prague Spring. The Hungarian uprising was 1956 and the Prague Spring was 1968. In 1968, the Prague Spring, led by Alexander Dubček, basically was trying to liberalize Czech politics, Czechoslovakian politics under the Soviet Union, really pushing for kind of a greater demand of freedom from the public. And he talked about creating socialism with a human face, basically allowing for a relaxation of some of those totalitarian policies. He tried to kind of balance, like, okay, we're going to do these reforms, and was still trying to kind of reassure the Soviet Union. But in August of that year, the Soviet Union and some other Warsaw Pact countries would actually invade Prague with and other major cities in Czechoslovakia with tanks. It was the biggest military operation in Europe since the Second World War. So it's no minor issue, and people in Czechoslovakia still look on that as a big turning point in their history. The Soviet Union also was really demanding a lot of conformity and publishing dissent. So there was sort of a little bit of a thaw in that, and you often see this in transitions between premieres, where Alexander Solzhenitsyn he published several books. One of them was called The Cancer Ward. One of them was called The Gulag Archipelago. One of them was called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which I have in the classroom if you ever want to check it out. Not like you're going to come back after the exam and be like, Miss Keller, I really want to read this book. I've heard it's really excellent. But kind of similar to Night, if you ever read that by Elie Wiesel, who describes his experiences living in in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. Solzhenitsyn describes a fictional character and his experiences in one day in a Soviet gulag. And well, they're different in the sense that the gulag's point was not to like exterminate a race. They're similar in this like ongoing starvation is sort of a theme, fear of reprisal and violence and so on. So there's some points of comparison there. By the way, if you're here, just let me know in the comments so I know that I'm not talking to a empty live stream. So Solzhenitsyn wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970. And unfortunately, the Soviet Union was really irritated by that. He was really popular in the West, but he was, after his publication of the Gulag Archipelago, he was arrested. Instead of being exiled to Siberia, he was deported to West Germany. So I guess that was sort of a symbol of détente. But they weren't going to allow him to publish in the Soviet Union. There's still censorship there. You see a lot of, what's the word I want to use? There's kind of a, under the Nazis, there was some collaboration by Catholic bishops. There was some protest by Catholic bishops. I mean, people's response to the Nazi regime was pretty broad under Catholicism. But in the Soviet Union, the Catholic Church actually becomes kind of central to, not just the Soviet Union, but the Eastern Bloc, central to the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. In 1982, I believe, Pope John Paul II was elected the Pope, and he was actually Polish. And I believe he was the first Polish Pope in history. But he then makes a trip back to Poland in the 80s, and there were all these restrictions from the Polish government about who he was allowed to talk to, concerns that he might support pushback against the regime, and so on. The Solidarity, which was a movement in Poland that was basically a labor union, but not just in one industry, like sort of a broader labor union, that they had really been agitating in Poland since about 1980. There was a man named Lech Walesa, Walesa, and then also Anna, oh gosh, I'm forgetting her last name. I want to say it was like Kervinsky, but I don't think that's right. There was a woman who led the strikes under Solidarity in Poland, if any of you want to Google that as well. Sorry, I'm just blanking on her name right now. But there were a bunch of strikes in Gdansk, so Gdansk, formerly known as Danzig, which had been a free city after World War I, had been taken back over by the Germans and then made Polish again after World War II. And the strikes there would lead to kind of further uprisings, and the Solidarity movement was really key to that. And when Solidarity had meetings, they start calling for free elections. But when Solidarity got together and had meetings, they would open them with a prayer. So that in and of itself was pretty revolutionary in Poland, because communist states were meant to be atheistic. They didn't want people to, Trotsky called religion the opium of the people. They basically didn't want people to have an allegiance, other than the state and the Communist Party. So Lech Walesa is important there. And then when Gorbachev, who was in 1985, he became the new Soviet premier, And that was a big shift because most of the previous premiers had been kind of somehow like connected to Stalin or kind of had grown up in that era. And Gorbachev was younger. I mean, he was 54, but he was significantly younger than Brezhnev would have been when he left office. And Khrushchev had been kind of in there with Stalin. He has his de-Stalinization program. Brezhnev was Khrushchev's kind of right hand man, and then Gorbachev was not really connected to as many of those. He was younger. He was more sophisticated. His wife was like this really beautiful, kind of fashion forward woman. So a lot of Soviets saw him as chance for like a new era in the Soviet Union. And he put two big policies into place. One is perestroika, Perestroika, which was like a restructuring of the economy and society. And then the other was glasnost, Glasnost, which was basically a bigger transparency in the Soviet system and from the state. So, for instance, when the um, Chernobyl nuclear meltdown happened, that was very soon after Glasnost. I want to say it was 1986, 87. I'd have to double check that date. But Glasnost was sort of a test for that. Like, how open are they going to be? And the answer was like still not totally transparent, but more transparent than they had been. There's an HBO series on Chernobyl that might scare the heck out of you if you want to go watch it after the exam. It gives you a really good sense of just how bad that meltdown was. I remember it happening. I was young, but I remember it happening, and there were concerns, but I had no idea how bad, how close they came to an even bigger meltdown that would have sent like nuclear winter across Europe, basically. So it's a pretty terrifying nuclear accident. Um, so once that solidarity grasps onto those big new Soviet reforms of perestroika and glasnost, um, in 1989, in January, solidarity was officially legalized, and the government was trying to keep kind of a monopoly of the Communist Party, but also open up Poland to Western business, especially. Um, that was honestly pretty impossible. And Valesa and Solidarity will really use that as an opportunity to push for more political freedom. The Communist Party in April of that year in Poland is going to basically give up its monopoly because they would have elections, but the only candidates would be approved by the Communist Party. So it was really always kind of a sham. They then have their first free election since before World War II, and Solidarity, like, just, won in a landslide. In December of 1990, Lech Walesa would be elected the first freely elected president of Poland. And then Poland's going to kind of like struggle with adjusting to like the economic realities of an unplanned economy, right? Because under communism things had been planned, but then also there were such shortages in consumer goods. I mean, I talked about simple things like hair dye, but also like toilet paper and food, and people couldn't get oranges in the Eastern Bloc. They were expensive and they were rare, or like bananas, things that had become very mainstream due to like globalized trade in the West. I don't want to make it seem like the East, though, was wholly like miserable and constantly suffering under shortages. Um, During the Cold War, the East German economy was like the 10th largest in the world. So it's not like they were totally backwards or anything like that. But they still just had things that they couldn't get or that they were forbidden from getting. I mean, something as simple as an Elvis record would have to be smuggled in. So, speaking of Germany, it's in Germany that things start to really fall apart. Like, we see a lot of reforms in Poland, but they're still kind of like holding it together. It pushes a lot of things in that direction, But the West Germans had never really accepted, I would say probably all Germans had never really accepted the division of Germany. Um, the original West German constitution had sort of provided a path for reunification. Um, East Germans, though, didn't really get to talk about it a whole lot because that would have been something reportable to the party. And there was a lot of push for reform, though. And they had, there had been all these attempts to escape East Berlin, to get into West Berlin so that you could escape to the east. And that's why the Berlin Wall was put up in the first place. But they started issuing these vacation visas. Now, I mentioned my best friend who was Slovak. When her family went on vacation, they had to leave one child behind to ensure they would come back. But those vacation visas were basically allowing people to go visit their families in the West. People from West Berlin had been able to come to the East, but people from the East couldn't go to the West. Um, and that's going to be, once they issue those visas, there's sort of an understanding that some of those people aren't going to come back. A protest breaks out on November 9th, 1989, that November 9th date that we've talked about has so much, you get so much mileage out of that one date. November 9th, 1799 is the coup d'etat of 18th Brumaire under Napoleon when he overthrows the Directory. November 9th, 1923 is the Beer Hall Putsch when Hitler tries to overthrow the state in Munich. November 9th, 1938 is that state-sponsored violence, Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, under the Nazis. And then November 9th is also when this protest breaks out in East Berlin. Now, this is why you can't use that date as like a reunification holiday, though, right? You can't turn that into a national holiday because it also had this dark Nazi past connected to it. East Berliners that day start kind of just moving towards the Berlin Wall, which on the eastern side had always been heavily guarded by, soldiers with guns. The soldiers aren't resisting at that point though, and the East Germans start like literally getting hammers and tearing the wall down, climbing over the wall. West Germans welcoming them with like oranges and bananas. They became kind of a symbol of like welcome to the West. Some of them giving them like handfuls of cash so they could go spend money on things they hadn't been able to get, so they could adjust to like a new life. And the West German chancellor at the time, Helmut Kohl, Kohl, which funnily enough in German means cabbage, and there's a lot of political cartoons drawing him as a head of cabbage because he was also kind of like rotund and round, is going to really start pushing towards reunification. And Honecker, which I think is Honnekeer, was the East German chancellor. Quickly leaves office. They have free elections, and they basically began the process of unification at that point. The other thing that had happened is they had opened the border between the looking at my map here real quick. They had opened the border between Hungary and Austria, and so people start flooding from the Eastern Bloc into Hungary and then across the border into Austria. And once that flood of refugees starts, like the Soviet Union kind of can't stop it. And the Soviet Union will officially dissolve in 1991 with varying degrees of success across the Eastern Bloc as to how that went. Like in Romania, for instance, it was much more violent. The Romanian I forget the official name of him, but he was a dictator, was pretty violent. His name was Ceausescu, and he had been, just a lot of corruption, living this very sort of wealthy lifestyle. There was a lot of Romanian orphans, meanwhile, were sort of abandoned in orphanages because their families couldn't afford to care for them because of the food shortages. And the state couldn't afford to deal with them either, so they end up just being ignored in these orphanages. And then there were just disastrous results for some of those kids, like failing to form attachments, and throughout the 90s it's this like ongoing sort of tragic story of what happened to them. I still don't see any questions in the chat. I'm going to check my email real quick and make sure there's no questions sitting in there. But if you all are good to go, I don't need to keep talking. I talked all day. If there's anything from any time period you want me to review, let me know. I'm just checking my email to see if there are any other questions. All right, what's my, I have this dual factor I can't even say it, authentication now, and it's a little slow for the teacher accounts. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the big thing that you would want to talk about would be like globalization, which is really going to, have a big effect on the whole world. But the uh, the economic system of the sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once here, and it's not going well. Sorry, the economic unity of the globe is just kind of this increasing integration and interdependence of like economic, social, cultural, and I mean, even the ecology, right? Because the green movement in the 60s had been very strong in Europe, and I would say it's significantly stronger than here. Like if you go to Germany, there's recycling everywhere, and everyone separates their trash. Like it's just very much a bigger part of German culture. There's a German Green Party, which is regularly like probably the third biggest party in Germany after behind the CDU, the Christian Democrats, and the Socialists. Sorry, my cat here is thinking it's dinner time. Yeah, it's not though. There's also some backlash to that though, like a real fear of kind of like the Coca-Cola Zero that we talked about after World War II, a fear of like losing your local and national identity to kind of these larger mega corporations. The economic, or sorry, the environmental impact of globalization with such a consumer culture too, I think becomes a big concern. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, nationalists tensions you'll see kind of rise in some of those Eastern Bloc country, like the Czechs and the Slovaks will sort of divide back into two separate countries, which really the Czech portion of Czechoslovakia had more industry and more natural resources than the Slovak part. But the Slovaks also felt like they were getting kind of constantly, for instance, all textbooks were in Czech, not in Slovak. And they're similar, and most Slovaks can understand Czech, but a lot of Czechs can't understand Slovak as well. They're not exactly the same language, and so that I don't think works out economically that well for Slovakia. Um, Yugoslavia falls apart. There's a joke that Tito, Tito, who had been the leader of Yugoslavia, was the only true Yugoslav, and that's going to lead to a pretty violent breakup. So Yugoslavia would have been Serbia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Macedonia, and there's really just this very vicious kind of multi-sided war with acts of genocide, with and as part of that genocide, like Serbs raping Bosnian Muslims as a way to like ruin their honor, but also to create more Serb children. The genocide in Kosovo in the late 90s is a part of that. Those are the only things I can think of that we haven't gotten to go into great detail on. Just looking at. Oh, I did want to say one more thing about countries and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia had what they called the Velvet Revolution in I mean, kind of looking at Poland and Hungary, which had free elections in the summer or fall in 1989, is really going to energize Czech resistance to kind of shed communist rule. There's a lot of student-led demonstrations, just as had been in 1968. But you know, what starts with like tear gas and things from the police, eventually they're going to be joined by, the students will be joined by workers and people from all over the place. And Václav Havel, who had been one of the leaders of the 1968 revolution, will become this kind of symbol of defiance against the Soviet Union. And Havel will actually be chosen as president in December of 1989. And then Alexander Dubček, who had been the leader of 1968, is brought out of exile and will become the head of the Czechoslovakian parliament. Those are the big things. We talked about Margaret Thatcher today. So Gorbachev's big two reforms are the ones I wanted to mention, and I'll probably actually go over those quickly in class on Wednesday as well. If you guys have no questions, I'm going to end it here and let you go on your merry way. I feel like you have all of the tools that you need. If there's something you're weak on, you know, go watch a crash course. Those videos are really great. I would go watch the one on decolonization because there's some good details on like specific countries in there. Yeah, and just start going all back over everything. I don't see any questions in my email, and I don't see any questions in the chat. So unless there's anything else, I'm going to end it now. Last call, no questions. I see nothing. All right, have a good night, all, and I will see you on Wednesday.